Well, right. So welcome everybody to this webinar on the question of military spending. My name is Colin Archer. I used to run the International Peace Bureau at the time when the global campaign on military spending was launched over 10 years ago. And I'm pleased that now in my retirement, I'm able to contribute to the work of GDAMS UK, which is hosting this session. We have three speakers. Kate Hudson, General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Richard Reeve, Coordinator, is it, of Rethinking Security. And Sam Perlo-Freeman, I think Senior Researcher is the title at Campaign Against the Arms Trade. Something like that.
Research Coordinator.
Oh, okay, fine. So there we have three people who are extremely knowledgeable on the subject, and I think will be able to provide us not only with information, but good political thinking about the, let's face it, very difficult political context that we face in this country on this particular issue at this time. Don't need to spell that out now. So, you know, they'll get about 10 minutes each. My suggestion is we take maybe a couple of questions after each one. Then Russell Whiting will say a little bit about the global campaign in the UK, of which he's the coordinator, and then we'll round up with a general discussion. I hope that's acceptable procedure. Very nice to see you all. Thanks for turning out on a windy night. And over to you, Kate, to kick us off.
Thanks, Colin, and thanks for inviting me. So military spending, including nuclear spending, is having a bit of a moment at the moment. Everyone's talking about it. And I'm sure a lot of that is to do with political positioning for the forthcoming election. We don't know when it is, but people obviously have already started their campaigns pretty much. And both Sunak and Starmer are really in overdrive on this question of military spending. So I'm going to just touch briefly on a couple of aspects of this. One is overall military spending to start off with. So Treasury figures show that core military spending was 54.2 billion in the last financial year. That's the one that's just ended. Britain already spends 2.3% of GDP on the military, and that's well above the NATO target of 2% GDP. To that, of course, you need to add military aid to Ukraine, which totaled just over 7 billion for the 3 financial years just gone. So Sunak, of course, has made clear the government's aspiration is to raise this to 2.5%. He hasn't been very specific about when. It's an aspiration. So it's pretty much no surprise that Starmer has trumpeted Labour's plan to raise military spending to 2.5% of GDP if and when it comes into government. And of course, this means billions of pounds more public funds for the military budget and being taken away from other essential spending. From an electoral point of view, no doubt Starmer's announcements are an attempt to allay Tory voter fears about whether or not Labour's a safe pair of hands when it comes to defence. This seems to have been a recurrent Labour anxiety over decades, not least since Labour's electoral failure in 1983 was wrongly ascribed to Labour's opposition to nuclear weapons under Michael Foot's leadership, rather than to the breakaway SDP splitting the vote. So both party leaders are competing to commit as much as they possibly can to military spending. So looking now more specifically at nuclear, both leaders, I would say, have been grandstanding over nuclear. In the last few weeks, both Sunak and Starmer have been up to Barrow to make big statements, or perhaps to be more accurate, statements that they want to sound big rather than actually being big. So first of all, Sunak. Well, he's actually in a bit of a mess over these questions. You may have seen currently he's in trouble with the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee, which has identified a gap in parliamentary scrutiny of MOD spending in their March report, which focuses on the MOD's 2020 to 2033 equipment plan. The committee said that the MOD had lacked, quote, the discipline to balance its budget by making the difficult choices about which equipment programs it can and can't afford. So a bit of a slap there. And of course, that is absolutely the right criticism. They kind of seem to say, we're going to have this, we're going to have that, without thinking about what they can actually afford. You may well remember that there was nothing much about military spending in the spring budget, but with his recent photo op trip up to Barrow, Sunak announced £200 million new funding for a so-called transformation fund for Barrow-in-Furness. That's the naval dockyard town. Well, no, not a naval, a dockyard town with the BAE Systems big shipyard where they build the submarines. And it's intended, so Sunak said, to make the town where the UK submarines are built an even more attractive place to live, work and build a career. Well, if you've been there, you'll see it's not actually really that attractive anyway. As David Cullen from NIS pointed out, I highly recommend their work, at 20 million a year for a decade, the fund is relatively modest compared to the funding gaps in the nuclear upgrade programs. And the only project actually named specifically in the announcement was the completion of the A595 Griesbeck bypass road, which I guess is a bypassing Barrow, which will be good for the town, I'm sure. However, last year saw some significant announcements on nuclear spending. There was 3 billion in the spring budget and a further 6 billion in the July 2023 Defence Command paper. But it seems to me that however much is thrown at the so-called nuclear enterprise, which is the term they now use for it, it's not enough to deal with the problems that beset the sector. It seems to be riddled with problems and incompetence. Trident out on patrol for ages, far longer than it should be, twice as long as it should be, shoddy maintenance work, failed missile tests, and so on. So, following Sunak's announcement, the government published its latest Defence Command paper entitled Delivering the UK's Nuclear Deterrent as a National Endeavour. So, despite all the problems faced by the MOD over nuclear, it doesn't include anything to address those issues. Well, I wrote a blog about it at the time, and I assessed it as little more than a public relations exercise full of spin, trying to make Britain seem like a serious nuclear contender, but mostly recycling old information. So, for example, about the replacement of submarines by Parliament in 2016. They also made reference to the replacement nuclear warhead, which the government committed to us to 3 years ago. That is now, by the way, called our sovereign warhead. So it's now the sovereign warhead, presumably to disguise the fact that it is a co-production with the US's new warhead and to offset accurate observations that the system isn't actually independent at all. So a bit more spin there. And it now has a name. It's called Astrea. It's Greek, of course. It's a bit of a misnomer, though, because in classical mythology, Astrea is the goddess of justice, innocence, purity, and precision. Not quite sure why they chose that name. AUKUS gets a mention too. That's the agreement by which the US and UK facilitate the provision of nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. Reading the small print there, it's pretty clear that Australia will be making, quotes, a significant investment into the UK's submarine industrial base. So they will be paying for the privilege of being tied closer into the US's military expansionism. So noticeable by its absence is any overall balance sheet of spending on nuclear. and that's information which has been promised but not yet forthcoming. And we're really hanging on waiting for it, because we're trying to prepare really up-to-date figures of the cost of Trident replacement. We currently have figures from some years ago totaling over 205 billion. It will now be significantly more than that. We want some detailed government information to get our figures accurate. So to start winding up then, Colin, just to say, last week, Starmer was also offered to Barrow. They're all going there for their big announcements. He wanted to announce Labour's, quotes, unshakable, absolute, total commitment to Trident. Trident, he says, is the bedrock of Labour's plan to keep Britain safe. And he made 3 commitments, which he argues will defend the UK economy and prioritise British jobs and skills. So he likes to throw this in to get trade union support. Firstly, to build all 4 new dreadnought nuclear submarines in the UK at Barrow. Secondly, to maintain Britain's so-called continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent. And thirdly, to deliver all future upgrades needed to properly equip Trident. So, in other words, nothing new there either. You know, they've already committed to that. What we can say, though, is that the commitment to increase the military budget, whether it comes from the Tories or Labour, means cuts elsewhere in government investment and public spending. It will come at the expense of the NHS, education, child poverty alleviation, and dealing with climate change. And I'm sure we can all think of other things that the money could be better spent on. So in short, to conclude, Colin, it's 2 leaders recycling old policies, committing vast sums to weapons of mass destruction. The vast sums will be inadequate, and the weapons will make the world a more dangerous place and put us all at greater risk. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kate. That's great. A very informative summary of the situation, especially on the nuclear side of things. Now, we could take maybe just a couple of questions or comments now on those issues. Anybody want to jump in? I mean, what about the other parties? Or maybe Richard's going to talk about that. Yeah. Okay. Right. Maybe we'll steer clear of them.
I'm happy just to take stuff in the discussion at the end. It's no problem.
Okay. Well, then let's go straight on to Richard. He's going to present, I think, the political context. Is that right? I'm not quite sure what your title would be, but anyway, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Thanks, everyone, for coming, and thanks to GCOMS for inviting me. Yeah, I'll talk about the political context of where we're at, what the commitments are from the parties, and where I think that comes from, and what's exceptional about the UK in this regard. Because I think thinking about things in terms of British exceptionalism, as so much of British politics and foreign policy is framed around, is quite important to understanding where we are and where we go from here. I think we need to start by acknowledging where we're at and why there is pressure for military spending, why this is a very different context than where we were 3 years ago, say. Clearly, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has changed things in terms of the political context, in terms of the European context, and that is something that political party leaders are going to want to respond to. They're going to be under pressure to respond to. And they're also going to be very cognizant of the political context in the US, given that basically UK grand strategy is to be as close as possible to the United States. That's particularly uncertain because of the US election in November and the transactional nature of the Trump administration, if he is to return to office, or indeed the civil instability that may occasion a contested election in the US. So in many ways, it's not surprising there is pressure to maintain or increase military spending at this time in a way that's quite different than, say, 3 or 4 years ago, when we were thinking very much about health and pandemic security, maybe thinking more about climate change than we are now, despite it being a problem that has got worse. But that's the context we're in. Now, clearly, other threats haven't gone away either. Climate change has clearly got much worse. Inequality is worse. We know what some of the costs of a health insecurity pandemic crisis can be, and yet we're moving resources out of preparing for those kind of crises or meeting those very existential crises through excessive attention to some of the military threats and stoking them in many ways through a competitive approach to geopolitics and rivalries with other great powers and doubling down on the US alliance. So what then are the political party positions? Well, Kate talked about Labour and Conservative having essentially the same policy, which is to increase spending to 2.5% of GDP when conditions allow. They both have exactly the same policy, despite the headlines you might have read last week, or is it this week, that Keir Starmer pledged to spend 2.5%. He didn't. He pledged to move towards that when they can, which is exactly the same as what the Tories have pledged. Other parties have also gone broadly in the same direction, but to a lesser extent. The SNP is now committing to spend 2% of GDP were Scotland an independent country. That's a significant increase on what they were planning a few years ago because of their intent to join NATO as a independent country and because of the greater attention within NATO to meeting that 2% of GDP minimum requirement. For the same reason, the Lib Dems have put a figure on defence expenditure for the first time I can remember, which is minimum 2%. So less than Tories and Labour, probably in aspiration terms, but still slightly above where they were. The outliers from it are perhaps what you might expect. Reform UK, which I would say is not really a political party, but a pressure group, indeed owned by Nigel Farage to be a pressure group, has a commitment to 2.5% within 3 years, so a firmer commitment than the Tories, a 3% commitment by 2030. So there's a degree of pressure from the right or the far right on the Conservatives to move in that direction. Not that Reform are going to be in a position to implement such a policy. And then from the other side, from the left, the Green movement, the Green Party, has no firm commitment in percentage terms, and indeed, its new policy on peace, security, and defence pledges to remove the minimum commitment within NATO to spend the minimum of 2% of GDP on military spending, albeit for the first time the Greens consented to be within NATO, subject to certain reforms. So broadly, the political parties are all moving in that similar direction towards higher military spending or removing pressure for reducing military spending. As Kate talked about, in terms of the Public Accounts Committee report on defence spending from last month, there are a number of black holes in government expenditure on the military, which essentially makes spending more an endless, thankless, and irresolvable task, I think, in the UK. Number one of them, as Kate mentioned, is the equipment plan, the plan to buy all kinds of equipment that the MOD can't afford. There's always a big black hole. They're always kicking timelines towards the right, so they have to pay for things later on, and avoiding making hard choices. And the MOD is terrible at that. It's been doing that for well, as long as I can remember. And perhaps not surprisingly, in most of the political party manifestos that are emerging, including Labour and the Lib Dems, and indeed Reform UK, there's a commitment to reforming the procurement policies of the MOD. Now, whether that's possible or not, it's hard to say, but past experience shows that there hasn't been really much improvement at all. That's number one, lack of reality in the procurement program. The second one is that the UK military is geared to power projection and expeditionary warfare outside Europe. So all these commitments to tilt to the so-called Indo-Pacific and support the US, Australia, and so on the other side of the world, to have bases in Brunei, in Singapore, in the Falkland Islands, in the Indian Ocean, in Kenya, in Belize, and so on, are extremely expensive. Having a military that is not operating in defense of national territory, or at least not mainland national territory, but designed to be deployed all over the world, is extremely expensive, and again is not subject to hard choices or reality, really, for a post-imperial country. And thirdly, exactly as Kate says, there's the so-called defense nuclear enterprise. I think the figure that the PAC put on this is the defense program has increased in cost by £38.2 billion since last year. Since last year, it has increased by over £38 billion. That's not an annual cost, but that's the total cost. That is huge. That dwarfs the holes in the conventional equipment procurement plan, the money that's not there to pay for salaries or recruitment or decent housing and so on. That is colossal. And it's, all these problems that Kate has pointed out in the Dreadnought submarine program, in the warhead costs, are again just ticking upwards, and deadlines, timelines moving further into the future. Again, no hard choices about what is actually affordable, as well as the ethical desirability of some of these weapons programs. I think there's one thing that really ties these all together, which is the AUKUS program with the US and Australia. This is quite a new program. It was announced in 2021, and further detail was given a year ago in spring 23. It is hugely expensive, not just for Australia, but it turns out for the UK. Timelines are extremely long, and it sucks us into not just funding military nuclear, but also civil nuclear and power projection well into the future. It's actually the AUKUS program that has been a trap for the Labour Party in terms of changing its pre-election defence policy. The one thing that distinguished Labour from the Conservatives until 2 years ago was that they were somewhat resistant to military entanglements in the Asia Pacific. But as soon as this supposedly industrially beneficial commitment to an ally in Australia came on board, and the Tories could talk about jobs coming into Barrow and so on, John Healey and Labour flipped their defence policy, so they're foursquare behind the military tilt to the Indo-Pacific, which I think is very unfortunate in the context. There's then three paradoxes which I think are really illustrative of exceptionalism in UK military policy that stem from this, that flow from this. The first is that, and these are all about British exceptionalism, the first is that the UK's commitments to power projection and military presence around the world are quite exceptional. Other than the US and France, perhaps Russia to a degree, they really aren't, it's really abnormal to expect to deploy your forces on the other side of the world, to have bases all over the world, we can see where it comes from the empire and the historic role, but it's very much out of kilter with the reality of the UK at present. And the paradox there comes from military spending, whereas the UK used to be exceptional in European terms, in terms of how much it spent on defence. It was spending 60% more as a percentage of its economy than the European average 10 years ago. Because of the shift in NATO military spending in the last 2 or 3 years, it's now spending about 10% more as a percentage of its economy. And yet its commitments are far, far different, far greater than almost any other country in Europe, with the exception of France and Russia. The second paradox is around military industries, and that the UK believes it should have a sovereign, as Kate says again, that phrase in quote marks, industrial capacity to build weapons for itself, and that it believes that it can subsidize those by exporting those weapons to other countries. So you see it with Tornado and Typhoon exports to Saudi Arabia and Gulf states in particular. And now through AUKUS, you can see it with the idea that we can subsidize the nuclear submarine program through selling them to Australia, likewise frigates and so on. The reality, I think, is we end up paying more than almost any other country for our military products, as well as creating these huge ethical dilemmas of exporting these weapons to authoritarian and interventionist states, because we're plugging holes in gaps. So we're building warships to unrealistic timeframes. We're building our own equipment at extreme expense rather than buying elsewhere. So that doesn't work either in cost terms or ethical terms. And thirdly, as a nuclear weapon state, we believe in the promise as a country of exceptional capability, exceptional threat from our nuclear weapons. The reality is they're so expensive that it takes all the money from a conventional weapons or defense posture, and it's very uncertain whether the weapons either deter or work, as we've seen with the missile launches, or whether we can actually afford to create weapons that can go to sea or fire. Finally, I think it's just worth touching on one other factor in exceptionalism in this country that makes these problems so difficult to resolve and difficult for politicians to confront, which is the role of the media. I thought it was surprising that the Public Accounts Committee pointed to an increase of £38.2 billion in 1 year in the budget for nuclear weapons in this country. Clearly, that wasn't something that the media thought was exceptional, because I saw not one headline outside some very specialist press on that. So there's silence on the costs of the nuclear. There's a very uncritical attitude to the Ministry of Defence and the armed forces in general, and a very critical and rather inaccurate portrayal of politicians on the left, of Jeremy Corbyn and Michael Foot, for example. And Starmer played rather effectively on that last week in his announcement, because the media duly reported that Labour had changed its policy on nuclear weapons, which of course it hadn't, because they never were changed from supporting continuous at-sea deterrence of nuclear weapons in 2017 and 2019. So there's a real system of exceptionalism that's deeply embedded, I think, in UK political culture, media culture, and social attitudes to an extent. Well, that's overplayed. And there's a lot of work to be done in just rethinking the idea of security, the idea of defense, and where the who the subjects of that are and where the emphasis of that should be, because it's a very twisted reality, I think, that we're currently working with, and that's shaping the political debate.
Thanks very much, Richard. That's a lot of thought-provoking stuff there, and I think the theme of exceptionalism is a good one to focus on. Would anyone like to ask a question or put in a comment to Richard on what he's said? Feel free. Yeah, Philip, Boston.
I think what I've noticed, particularly over the last few months, and thanks very much, Richard, for your comments on the role of our international relationships and the sort of pressure that puts. But I think do you have anything to add about pressure from other NATO members? Because I think that seems to be quite a strong headwind there, which is people, particularly from Baltic states and I guess those living closer to Russia than we are. There seems to be sort of trying to egg each other on, in a sense. So, you know, we want to spend more. No, you spend more. And sort of. So there's a sort of sense that needing NATO states looking at each other and trying to get each other to man up, for want of a better phrase, and sort of boost spending. How does that relate, do you think?
I think it changes the overall picture in terms of the average spend in NATO has gone up very sharply in the last few years, and that's been particularly because Poland and Baltic states and now Finland have put up their military spending so much, in Central European states. I mean, most of them started out well below the 2%, so they're quite some distance to travel. I think the UK ducks the pressure on that significantly because it's always spent above 2%, as one of only 3 countries with the US and Greece that have done so. And of course, it's Germany that really draws the fire because it's the big country at the heart of Europe that has spent far less and is seen to have spent far less. So yes, there's a degree of mutual pressure, but I think it's very much US driven overall and far more directed at Germany and countries in kind of central Western Europe than the UK.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Stuart.
Hi, thanks very much. That was really interesting, and Kate's as well. A couple of thoughts. I mean, to give another example about the biased media coverage, the whole issue recently around Marc Francois from the Defence Committee saying, posing a question, are we going to run out of, in a shooting war with Russia, we're going to run out of ammunition in 2 months, and that being widely reported, even though, as even the Defence Secretary pointed out, Britain is in NATO and therefore that situation wouldn't arise. Just to give one example, and another element around the unquestioning situation that we get on military equipment is just any sort of international comparisons about how well armed Britain is. And if you look at international comparisons on conventional weapons, not just the fact that we're one of the 5 biggest nuclear weapons nations, on things like aircraft carriers, frigates, destroyers, attack helicopters, fighter planes, we're all up in the top 10. And the idea that we're somehow this weak military power that needs to spend more and more to have a seat at the top table is just so ludicrous. Yeah, I just thought I'd add that.
Thanks, Stuart. That's very helpful. I'd like to move on to Sam, and then we've got all the inputs to have our discussion towards the end. So over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, really interesting presentations. So I'm going to dig down a bit more into the numbers because in the UK and Europe, because that's what I do. But first, yeah, I want to say a little more about the sort of political background and the way money is spent, expanding on what Richard and just now Stuart was saying. It really is extremely worrying, the language that's being used. UK and European figures, you know, talking about us being in a pre-war situation, as if war with Russia is now inevitable, which is crazy, and you know, makes that talking like that makes that outcome more likely. I mean, I can well understand that Poland, the Baltics, Finland are pretty nervous about Russia as they've, you know, actually gone and invaded Ukraine. But when you think about the total combined spending and forces of all the European NATO members, now including Finland and Sweden, far exceeds Russia. And the idea that Russia could invade Central and Western Europe, even if somehow they do break through in Ukraine, where they'd then be facing a possibly decades-long insurgency, which would mire their forces down completely. It's really quite an absurd idea. But there's this whole idea of, you know, bidding up how desperately much we need to spend to fend off Russia. And in that sense, it seems really quite a absurd, as well as, you know, just dangerous way of talking. But also there's the fact that the UK, as we've been hearing, but European countries generally spend their money very badly. They keep saying we need more and more, but there's so much spending on, you know, the most fancy systems you can get. This is especially true of the UK and France, nuclear weapons which have no military use whatsoever, or if they are used, it's, you know, the end of humanity pretty much. And it turns out that what Ukraine needs at the moment is just loads and loads and loads of artillery shells and air defense missiles. And for all the sort of fancy technology that we boast of, can't produce enough. And it's partly because the arms companies have been prioritizing exports outside the EU. So there's this complete, even within military spending, misprioritization in terms of if you actually are interested in defense, rather than, as Richard talks about, power projection, the fantasy that we're going to get involved in a war in the Asia Pacific, and the unfortunately not fantasy, but every time a disaster, of getting involved in more wars in the Middle East. And as Richard said, in Britain, the procurement system is broken and has been described as broken by every observer who's looked at it for decades. The Public Accounts Committee, the Defence Committee in Parliament fume about it constantly. And they say there's been however many major rounds of procurement reforms over the past couple of decades, and none of them have changed anything. So it's broken for the taxpayer. It's broken in terms of other public spending priorities. It's broken even for the military, in narrow military terms, of getting equipment that they think they need. You know who it's not broken for? The arms industry. They always do extremely well, and the government is always trying to pull them closer and closer, talking about them not as suppliers and the MOD as a customer, but as partners. And they're talking now in the 23 Defence Command paper about a new alliance with industry. They're not a private company seeking to make a profit. They're part of Team GB, working for the greater glory of global Britain. Well, they're not. They're out to make a profit, and they do make a profit, while delivering extremely poorly. So if you're saying, oh, we need to be able to defend against Russia, well, how about stop spending so much on these gold-plated systems, stop positing the arms industry and feeding their shareholders, and actually spend the money on stuff that's useful for defense, and you could probably do that with quite a lot less. However, as I say, I want to get on to some of the numbers. So I'm going to, oh, can I share screen? Okay, if you enable that for me, you might have to make me a co-host or something. First for UK and then more broadly in Europe, because they can be very confusing. The MOD has different sets of figures. They change the way they measure things a lot. Right, here we go. So the first, here's 3 different ways of measuring UK military spending. This is in current prices, so not adjusted for inflation, since 2000. We haven't got the CIPRI figure yet for 2023. So the blue MOD line, that's specifically the MOD figures for net cash requirement. So the actual amount of cash that they need from the Treasury. The core budget, the departmental expenditure limits, it sort of over this period, it's varied what they put in it. So it can get a bit inconsistent. Now, the red line is what they've reported to NATO, and you see that for a long time it's pretty similar. And then suddenly, since about 2012, that red line has got much higher. This is because in the figures that the UK reports to NATO, they've started including a whole lot of other things that aren't in the MOD budget. So, for example, the extra that the Treasury pays to top up the MOD's pension fund every year, some operational costs, I think, MOD's income, which partly funds its spending, and so forth. And they did this to get the figure over 2%. Now, CIPRI's done an analysis of this and have said, yes, some of these additions are justified in terms of CIPRI's methodology, so we'll include them. Some of them we're not so sure of. So CIPRI's figure was quite a lot higher than either the NATO or MOD because they've tried to be consistent over time. Then it was more following the NATO figure, roughly. In 2022, it's gone higher, and I think this is the Ukraine aid. I suspect that the Ukraine aid hasn't been included in the NATO figure, or the MOD figure. That's my best guess about that. Moving on just to see it in constant prices. So this is adjusting for inflation. Similar sorts of picture now, but what's interesting is that while NATO figures have, CIPRI figures have shown it continuing to go up, and again, I think this is the military aid, NATO's been showing it going down, and in 2023, the MOD as well. And actually, it's scheduled to go down for 2024. So in many ways, though everyone's talking about needing more military spending, it seems to be a lot of it is all talk and no action, or all hat and no cattle, as they say in Texas. The Treasury, at least, seems to be acting as a bit of a restraining force on the rearmament process, which is probably quite frustrating to the militarists. This is now showing, using the MOD cash figures, the share of GDP, the red line, and the share of total government expenditure, central and local. So the share of total government expenditure has gone steadily down. The share of GDP has remained fairly flat. And as you can see, if you don't all add in all the extra things that they report to NATO, it actually goes below 2%. So that's why they changed what they reported to NATO. Moving on to the European picture, this here we do see a very clear increase since 2014. 2014 was about the trough of European military spending. partly the aftermath of the financial crisis and austerity, and partly, of course, that was when the first Ukraine war broke out. And it's pretty much a straight line going up, but even faster perhaps in 2023. And all the signs are it's going to go up further. And now looking at some of the top spenders. So this is again, inflation. This is all inflation adjusted prices. UK, as I said, this is the NATO figures for comparability for all the countries. And the UK's reporting to NATO has been more consistent over this shorter period. So the UK actually hasn't increased nearly as much as you might think from the rhetoric, which I guess is a good thing, but it's just quite striking the difference between the rhetoric and the reality. Germany has gone up really quite massively, France more slowly, so that Germany is overtaken, and just some of the other fairly substantial spenders, mostly to see the comparison of Poland, which unsurprisingly has massively increased spending, overtaking Spain and approaching Italy. And their spending, I think it was now something like over 3% of GDP. It's they are really rearming seriously. So European spending is going up. But when Sunak and Starmer are talking about reaching 2.5% when conditions allow, well, if they keep to their so-called fiscal rules, then given the sort of anemic growth rate that the UK has been having, I don't think conditions are going to allow in a hurry. But really, the big question is going to be the fight for priorities. With the little bit of growth we might get, is that going to go into health, climate change, or is any fiscal headroom going to go to the military? Okay, so I think I'll finish there.
Can you remove the share screen?
Good point. Yes. Let me get back to the Zoom. Where's my Zoom? Oh, stop share. Too many tabs.
Very good. Thanks so much for all that, Sam. It does remind us how devilishly complicated it is once you start getting into the real nitty-gritty of the numbers. But I hope we won't spend the last few minutes on that. I think, what is to be done is always the key question. We have a campaign. We are in the middle of the Global Days of Action on military spending. We have an election coming up. I wonder if, Russell, you could just quickly put us in the picture, quick description of what GDAMS UK is all about.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. So Global Campaign on Military Spending UK is a coalition of about 30 organisations across the peace movement and beyond that are committed to campaigning for a reduction in military spending and for that money to be diverted and reinvested into social good. Last Friday, perhaps coincidentally, I'm sure coincidentally, while Keir Starmer was standing at Barrow, it was the start of the Global Days of Action on Military Spending, which is happening around the world. Well over kind of 250 organisations involved around the world with that. And that is to shine a light on the amount of military spending that is happening, not just in our own countries, but on the global scale. And as Sam just said, the CIPRI figures, which kind of give an indication of that, are released on Monday. I've actually been able to have a sneak preview of those today, but I'm not allowed to say anything about that, so look out for that on Monday. You won't want to miss it, is all I'm allowed to say. But throughout the next month, up until the 15th of May, GCOMS UK has got various ways for you to get involved. We're planning another webinar in a few weeks looking at the link between the military and climate change, and there's various other ways for you to get involved locally and online as well. So do keep an eye on our website and our social media pages, and I'll post the link to those in the chat for everyone so you can follow that. Thanks, Colin.
Thank you, Russell, for being so quick. Just to say, following up the question or the comment from Tina in the chat there about figures comparing, military with the environmental spending, just to tell you that we have produced last year a very useful little booklet which goes into this precise point. It's very popular. It puts out the arguments and the figures very clearly. I have several hundred still left, so if you'd like a batch, just get in touch with me and I'll send them to you. Right. Now, what about any further commentary or questions? Or yes, Sandra?
Yes, it's about the minute. Because of all the ongoing action, I'm just struck how often now on news programs everywhere there are lots and lots of discussion and questioning assumptions when it's at the fast pace that such discussions go doesn't seem part of the remit of what's discussed. And there is confusion even in my mind now about where money, if you want a military endeavour or whatever, needs to be spent, because we've seen so much about drones and also the idea that Israel in the Lebanon in the recent attack was protected by the Iron Shield. I mean, all these things I've heard of, but the confusion in my mind, which is probably less than in others, is what is defense, what is aggression, what weapons, even if you are being realistic, are we really trying to talk about and dispel myths about?
Not sure if I caught the end of that, but I think myth busting is very much the business that we're in. Russell.
I just wanted to kind of follow on from what a couple of colleagues said earlier about the role of the media. I just think it's interesting that it seemed for about the first 3 months of this year, every time I turned my TV on, a Labour politician was being asked to justify their £28 billion of spending on tackling climate change and the green revolution or Green New Deal, to the point where that was actually junked. But then Keir Starmer goes to Barrow last week and promises or pledges or aims billions of pounds more spending on the military. And as far as I've seen, no one's been asked a single question about where this money's coming from, what's going to be cut elsewhere, what taxes are going to be raised. So it seems that not only are we up against the media in their kind of projection of the military, we're also up against the fact that they don't want to question our politicians on their plans for the military as well.
Anyone else want to jump in here? I mean, there's so many different forms of action that can be taken. I mean, I'm wondering whether it's worth tackling the question of what to put to your MP. If you've got one question, what do you want to focus on? Where are the vulnerable points? Anybody want to answer that one?
Well, can I just say something? I mean, just about CND's ongoing campaigns. I mean, we haven't touched on it this evening, obviously, because it's slightly outside the framework of UK military spending, but obviously a big factor in terms of the dangers that we're presented with is the fact that the United States is actively planning to and preparing the ground to bring nuclear weapons back to Britain, to so-called RAF Lakenheath. So that's another thing, another big risk factor, which weapons, whoever they're provided by, are contributing to. So I think that's a very important campaigning thing. given the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the complicity of our government and so on, I think that campaigning to end the arms sales to Israel, which our government is still actively doing, refusing to publish the legal opinion on it, I think campaigning and lobbying our MPs to bring a halt to that is very, very important as well. And in fact, there is going to be a protest outside, or lobby outside Parliament tomorrow evening, because the MPs have just come back. So people will be there tomorrow evening calling on MPs to stop the arms sales. I mean, as you started off by saying at the beginning, Colin, we're in an exceptionally dangerous period, so many different threats. So it's hard to, to cope with it all sometimes, but the result is there are very many ways in which we can get active, and many ways in which we can approach our MPs to take action on our behalf.
Yes, absolutely. And, there are lots of terrific resources out there, and people shouldn't feel sort of alone with the problem of how to frame a question or what evidence to bring in or whatever. I mean, you mentioned in the chat there the really good stuff from the Scientists for Global Responsibility, and the other organizations that are listed at the top of the chat as well. So, yeah, plenty to do. I think the thing is try to find some allies and get cracking. We're coming up to our hour, but we don't have to cut it off immediately if there are things people want to explore. Is anyone there feeling they want to, tackle any other aspects?
Just
Yes,
another comment following up on what Kate said. That for CAAT, obviously, as well, opposing arms sales to Israel is a very major priority. We've been doing a lot on exposing just the role of the UK in arming Israel, which is often hidden because it consists basically entirely of components mostly sold to the US for inclusion in the planes and other stuff that they supply Israel with, and of course the spare parts that go with them. The organization, the Palestinian Human Rights Organization Al-Haq, along with GLAN, the Global Legal Action Network, they're trying to take the government to court over arms to Israel for a judicial review. They were initially declined permission, but they get to have an oral hearing to try to convince the judge to let it go forward, and that's on Tuesday. And there's going to be a small presence outside the court from sort of 8-9 a.m. Before the hearing. You don't want to look like you're protesting against judges that you're trying to convince. So, sort of small vigil-like presence. But if you're interested, yes. And there was something else I'm going to say, but I can't remember, so it's probably not very important.
Well, meanwhile, Tina wants to come in, or is your name Nanas?
The group was called Nanas. That we were an anti-cracking group.
Oh, right, got it.
So basically, we were very inconvenient older ladies who just interfered with cracking until it stopped. So I've been somewhat obsessed with the subject since 2011, and we saw it through to the moratorium in 2019. And the last campaign we did was like 1,000 days continuously at the roadside on Preston New Road near Blackpool, where I live.
1,000 days.
Yeah, so I already know how much people like us all put into, our campaigns. And I see it with the anti-war movement, anti-nuclear, environmental groups, nature groups. And I'm involved a little bit in all of them, but obviously I was focused on fracking for a while. And it struck me that there are so many parts where we have that overlap. And I don't want to reinvent the wheel or anything, so I'm kind of shortcutting by gate crashing other people's meetings to find out how much we are already doing together or how much we can do together. I mean, I actually started out being angry about the Iraq war, which has got me into thinking about activism, but then didn't get there until 2011 when I got involved in environmental. But to me, in my network, and it's quite a big network, I don't hear enough of this overlap. And then I'm watching the bombs going off, like, over Gaza and things like that, and you're thinking, Jesus, everyone's buying a bamboo toothbrush and recycling, and everything is undone continuously by this continuing, and why don't we talk about it as much? And why wouldn't that be a really good stick to batter people with, and a point to make when you say, well, Israel and Palestine are sharing the resources of the same region, the same water, the same air. And that's being polluted for all of them for now and for future generations. And so I just thought there was messaging somewhere where we could overlap that would hopefully stop the war, stop the environment being screwed up, and achieve all our aims. So not that I'm expecting you to do anything about that. I'm just saying that's kind of why I'm here and staring at you all and things. So thank you.
Great, that's a really useful reminder. I hope you're on YouTube or something somewhere, Tina. That was a really, really good speech. Yeah,
Oh,
fantastic.
thank you.
Right, Philip, from the Fellowship of Reconciliation.
No, Northern French
Sorry,
Peace Corps.
Quakers. I'm getting mixed up now.
Yeah, I'm also one of the steering group for a number
That's
of
right.
this evening, for GCOMS, and I think GCOMS and Rethinking Security and a number of other networks have been and continue to be keen to build stronger links with the environmental movements, and there is within XR, for instance, there's XR Peace, which is very committed to making these links and building common cause around climate and militarism. So, I mean, I think if you know, Tina, people who would like to become more actively involved specifically in this aspect of military spending, and that would be great, because I think it's been one of our aspirations as a steering group for quite a while. So whether it's you or other people you know who might want to be involved, that would be great to sort of build those stronger links. And Stuart, who's put his hand up to speak, but as Scientists for Global Responsibility, they do incredible work sort of making those links there. And Stuart may want to say something more about that now, but just leave it to him now.
Yes, if I can come in. The first thing I'll do is suggest come to the GCOMS workshop that we're planning, but we haven't announced a date yet. So hopefully soon we will, about the Russell mentioned about climate and military spending. There is another one at a European level, that's another webinar at European level that's coming up as well. I would have to dig through my emails to find that and put it in the chat, but there is actually, I'll tell you, I'll put one organization in the one link for you in the chat, which is an international network that works on climate and militarism issues, and which lots of groups, including many of the ones represented here, are members of, and they're always looking for more help, and they're planning a sort of week of awareness raising on the run up to the next conference of the parties meeting, climate meeting in October. So that's another thing to have a look at and get involved in. And they're trying to build a bigger network. At the COP meeting last year, all the issues that you were just talking about, the environmental issues that are affecting Gaza and Ukraine, were raised at that issue, and they got a bit of a hearing last year in a way that they hadn't done before. So it's growing, awareness is growing, and links are being made, but we still got to keep banging away because the military industrial complex is so powerful.
As they say, war never sleeps. Right, I think we're coming towards the end, unless somebody's bursting to add something more. One thing that we can all do is to make sure that the recording of this discussion, is spread as widely as possible around our networks.